Have you ever wondered why it is that so much of the modern world feels as though it is in opposition to your own ideal? We arrive now at the central question of this series. What is Apolloism, and why is it the answer to the problems that beset the West? The god Apollo, who stands at the center of this revival religion, may seem to some a curious choice. After all, if one was seeking to revive an ancient religion, why wouldn't he seek instead to revive a Norse or Celtic religion, based on the myths sometimes believed to comprise those lost religions? How surprised would you be to find that there is little evidence to suggest that the Norse and Celtic myths predate Christianity, or at least in any recognizable developed form? How surprised would you be to find that their primary stories, which evince biblical influence, arrive to us through medieval Christian sources, often through the Church itself? But perhaps we should ask first, is the messaging in these myths even useful towards civilizational aims? Should, for example, we be honoring chieftain gods like Dogda or Odin, both whom the Romans appear to have related to Mercury? Mercury was in their pantheons a herald, and, like Odin, a guide of the dead, but he was also a merchant, thief, and, like Odin, a trickster and magician. In fact, Mercury, a serpent god akin to Bacchus, may himself describe an Eastern, non-European archetype. Is Ragnarok, where all the gods are slain in cataclysmic warfare, only to usher in a new era under the curiously Christ-like dying and rising god Balder, a healthy and useful myth for us? But perhaps the far more important question is, have these myths been shown to form the basis of any meaningful, significant, or potent civilization? Or ultimately is the instinct toward these Celtic and Norse myths born of an instinct toward primitivism, toward fantasy book escapism, toward bowing out of a civilizational contest, toward shrouding oneself in a mystical identity? Some believe that a national myth or a religion, whether Christianity or pagan, while useful as propaganda, is pliable and can be turned in any direction, whatever its original design or intention. And here many believe, or at least argue, that this original intention can only be guessed at, and is, in any case, always up for interpretation, such as Christ's command that one should not resist evil persons. Hence, they posit that the use of inscrutable myths or religions as pretty but ultimately meaningless cloaks to their true political message, indifferent to whether or not these cloaks, upon closer investigation, seem to contradict the political message that seeks cover within them. As a consequence, these appropriators render their message contradictory, incoherent, unsophisticated, and, to intelligent people, unappealing. Then there are those who give lip service to the notion that politics lie downstream from culture, yet act as though myth and religion are irrelevant to concrete political problems. Rather, in their view, it is far wiser to avoid the topic altogether, lest one become offensive or divisive or engage in iconoclasm. Hence, in a manner, every ostensibly European tradition, whether pagan or Christian, is understood as equally valid. One may argue this position is not entirely distinct from Franz Boas' notion of cultural relativism, where we find the Bantu a cultural equal of the 18th century Englishman or the ancient Roman. Here the thinking is that increasingly censored, deplatformed, criminalized, poorly funded, and cloistered dissident online and regional enclaves are capable of reaching large audiences, so should develop culturally neutral, inoffensive, populist propaganda. This despite the fact that their political message is far more offensive than any currently proposed cultural or religious presentation. REM theorists, in contrast, believe that their message should target especially intelligent, culturally sophisticated, ambitious, talented, creative, free-thinking, open yet critically minded, successful and well-positioned persons capable of actually making a difference. Idealistic people, people who want to save the world, people who want to save civilization. REM theorists believe in the power of myth. They believe that the stories we tell inspire us, motivate us, and unite us in a way baser considerations like wealth, social status, and day-to-day politics cannot. Likewise, they believe myth and religion may and have been developed consciously and intelligently to evoke a psychological or spiritual effect in intended audiences or religious flocks. They do perceive a symbolic coherency among both salient, modern, and ancient myths. They believe that through a revival and even refinement of interpretatio Romana, or Roman interpretation, not only may healthy myth be perceived among pre-existing myth in the world, it may be consciously and intelligently developed to produce a moralizing and eugenic effect in a people. But why Apolloism? And why focus on this one god of a pantheon of gods? To be clear, REM theorists or Apollonians advocate for the veneration of multiple important celestial deities and the sober-headed understanding of them all, as each represents useful archetypes that may be used in parable, whether openly or veiled, whether as protagonists or antagonists, toward the purpose of moralization. Nevertheless, Apollo is very reasonably understood as the most important god of the ancient Greco-Roman world. Indeed, if this world had a figure of comparable relative significance to Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, it is surely Apollo, son of Jupiter, prince of the celestial gods. Apollo was known as the Hyperborean. This means that he was descended from Hyperborea, a mythical realm sometimes placed by ancient mythographers in Eastern Europe, whether in ancient Thrace or Dacia, but sometimes it was believed to lie as far north as Great Britain and even the Arctic. The Hyperboreans themselves were often associated with the barbaric Gauls. Commonly, Hyperborea was understood as the northernmost land in existence. Indeed, the name Hyperborea means above the north winds. It is said that among all the Olympians, Apollo alone was worshipped by the Hyperboreans. In fact, mythographers indicate that it was the race of Hyperboreans who erected the temples at Delphi and Delos. Hyperborea was known as a land of giants, suggesting indeed that it was a land of tall and physically large men. The three primary priests of Apollo's mythic cult in Hyperborea were giants descended of Boreas, the embodiment of the north wind. Their mother was the goddess Chione, whose name means snow, here a picture akin to the frost giants of Norse myth form. Yet in Norse myth, these tall Nordic beings were the enemies and not the heroes of that unusual myth body, a myth body that notably lacks an unequivocal male solar god. In other words, here we are unmistakably given a sense especially of a northern Nordic type, a European type, who evolved in the harsh winters of Northern Europe. Indeed, in the 17th and 18th century, Swedes, seeking to venerate a Gothic national history, came to identify themselves with the Hyperboreans. In the 6th century, the Gothic historian Jordanes claimed that the Goths came from a cold island called Skansa, which is guessed to be modern-day Scandinavia. He referred to Skansa as a womb of nations, implying a race of civilizational founders and shapers emerged from this northern realm. Apollo was likewise a founder of civilizations. Indeed, the epithet archaetes means founder, and of all the Greek gods it was applied especially to Apollo, who was known as a colonizer. The famous Greek scholar Callimachus remarked that it was under the lead of Apollo that, quote, men measured out their cities, as the god takes pleasure in the establishment of cities, himself contriving their foundations. Apollo as well was understood as Patrois, meaning from the fathers, or related to the fathers. Apollo was described as golden-haired and with eyes that shine as rays of light. He was also described as the most Greek. Thus, with his cult, we see the Nordic type posited as a physical ideal among the ancient Greeks. To be clear, it appears that the Apollonian cult was consciously developed as a eugenic cult in urbanizing conditions, seeking the rejuvenation of an original founding type, and it seems possible to perceive the effect. As late as the 4th century AD, Adeimantus, an Alexandrian scientist, wrote, "Of all the nations, the Greeks have the fairest eyes. Wherever the Hellenic and Ionic race has been kept pure, we see tall men of fairly broad and straight build, of fairly light skin and blonde." The Ionians, in particular, were understood as descended from Apollo Petroeus. Apollo was understood as the most perfect of the gods, not just a breeding model, but an aspirational ideal of men. In the ancient religion, the polymathic god is a god of intelligence, beauty, athletics, warfare, art, and poetry. He's a prince and a leader of men. The spring rituals of the Thargelia, dedicated to Apollo, where 2 ugly, deformed, or criminal men were expelled from a community, would corroborate the thesis that the Apollonian cult was effectively a eugenics cult. The idols of the god Apollo himself, the heroic depictions of the god or his heroic avatars in parable, also served a clear eugenic function. These models were ideals against which to measure men and encourage a rejuvenating eugenic mate selection, but there is more. In ancient Greek society, the kouros, or Greek youth, as he entered manhood, was initiated into the phratry, which means brotherhood or fraternity. Phratry may also mean kinfolk and was considered a subdivision of phyle, or tribe. The phratry, who were related specifically to the cult of Apollo, controlled access to civic society, and membership within the phratry was a requirement for citizenship. The phratries contained smaller kin groups known as geni or gene, meaning race, stock, or kin. It is from this word that we derive the modern English word gene and genetics. These subdivisions arose later than the phratries and appeared to comprise noble families. Eventually, gene would become associated with hereditary priestly function. Here it seems we see even a conscious refinement toward racial or eugenic thinking amid increasingly urbanized conditions. We also see a concern with genetics becoming religion. And to be sure, Apollonians do understand Apolloism as a religio-political solution. Indeed, as it was in Greece and in Rome, ultimately art, religion, and state are to be one, managed by those with an interest in the protection and amelioration of our gens or gene. Apolloism is a reform religion. It is not a cargo cult. It seeks inspiration from the ancient cult of Apollo, but does not hope to recreate it exactly, even if this were possible. In fact, it does not even consider this desirable. Indeed, some of the myths, for example, around Apollo, Apollonians perceive as developed unwisely or even subversively from an adversarial perspective, perhaps to humble the god and the people he represents. As it concerns reviving the cult of Apollo, with every one of its aspects, Apollonians would rely first on their healthy instincts. Healthy myths would be identified as canonical, whereas other myths would be identified as profane or degenerate. Apollo is unequivocally a metaphor and synonym of our gens. More, he is by far the clearest and best representation of this surviving from a pre-Christian past. Because Apollo is a synonym for our gens, Apollonians consider him sacred. Thus, naturally, they condemn those who would deny him or place another god or goddess above him. The metaphor of the sun, a symbol of ultimate power and fertility to which Apollo is connected, is virtually unsurpassable as a symbol of moralizing identity. Indeed, Napoleon once said, "If I had to choose a religion, the sun as the universal giver of life would be my god."